You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game, and we will be doing lots of politics and public policy this evening, because we have as our guest Ralph Martire, and I think he would like me to emphasize that we'll be doing lots of public policy because he is the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. You'll see his name up on the screen and the graphic from time to time, and it'll only say Center for Tax and Budget because, Ralph, your organization's name is just too long. So I'll have to remind him every time we put it up. It's Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, okay, which is key.
Well, you know, if you have a think tank, you need a long and ponderous name, so there you go.
So they were thinking of the name, and they kept thinking, they came up with a long name. Ralph teaches a master's level class in education finance and fiscal policy, perhaps alternating years, at both the University of Illinois and Roosevelt University. He is on the U.S. Department of Education Equity and Excellence Commission. He has an undergraduate degree from Indiana University. That's Phi Beta Kappa, bachelor's in history, right? Right. And a JD. He's a recovering lawyer. You're not practicing law anymore, are you?
Just for some friends.
Just for, okay. So if you're a bud of Ralph Martire, if you're a good friend, he will practice a little bit of law. But it was a long time. It was at Schiff, Hardin & Wade, right?
It was at Schiff, yeah.
Okay. A very distinguished firm, still a very distinguished firm here, a major loop law firm. Anyway, his law degree is from the University of Michigan. He is married. He has 2 kids. He coaches Little League Baseball, boys basketball, girls soccer. He is a bon vivant in the suburbs. We won't ask where he lives unless you want to tell him.
River Forest. In fact, I'm on the school board. I am an elected official.
I didn't know you were on the school board. I once was on the school board. How many years have you been there?
I'm going into my 2nd year.
All right. Well, you know, after 4 years, I declared victory and went home and started the show. Whether Ralph would think that was a good or bad idea, we'll find out. But so, Ralph, what people want to know, we're taping the show on August 26, 2012. And if they've been watching our show, they've seen we've had, over the last 3 months, just a parade of people dealing with the so-called pension reform issue. I think all of the people on the governor's working group, Darlene Sanger, Republican from Naperville, Elaine Neckritz, Democrat from Northbrook, I think, Bill Brady, downstate, Republican, former candidate for governor, and Mike Noland, okay? We've had brief discussions with Speaker Mike Madigan. We've had many others. And what does it come down to, Ralph? I mean, you've talked with all of these people too. I'm sure you spend a lot of time in Springfield, here in Chicago. So if you were king and you had 30 seconds to articulate your policy for pension reform, what would it be?
Well, it would take longer than 30 seconds.
But give us the 30 seconds.
More than one thing, but I think the very first thing that they have to do is just not on the table, and that is throw the current pension funding ramp out the window. It's unaffordable and it's unattainable, and even if all of these reforms that are being put on the table, you could look at some of the most aggressive are actually the ones proposed by the governor in taking away benefits and asking for additional contributions from workers to reduce the liability of the state going forward. Even if they all pass, the state still won't be able to make the payments under the current repayment structure, which means you need to take a step back and try to understand what actually caused the unfunded liability in the first place. And what will surprise most people is nothing inherent in the pension system caused it. In fact, if all that was causing sort of unfunded liability in the state of Illinois were either salary or benefit increases or changes in assumptions, those kinds of things, the pensions would be around 92% funded today. The real problem is a sad legacy of Illinois being incredibly irresponsible and borrowing against the employer contribution to the pension system for over 40 years to subsidize the delivery of current public services to voters and taxpayers. So for us taxpayers, that's a good deal for 30 or 40 years because we never had to pay full dollar for the services we were consuming. But now the repayment of the debt is due, and the repayment structure that was agreed to is simply unaffordable, and it's crushing the fiscal system. And I'll give you numbers, because I hate to just talk in abstracts. So last year, fiscal year 2012, the total pension contribution to all 5 systems the state has responsibility for was just over $4 billion. This year, it jumped to $5.09 billion, a 23% increase in 1 year. Now, the normal cost, the employer cost for funding the benefits in that system In 2012 were $1.6 billion. The rest was debt service. In 2013, $1.5 billion, less than last year because so many people have left the system. In fact, all the growth in cost is this repayment of debt. So we've kind of created an issue in the state from a public policy standpoint by calling it pension debt. I think we should just call it debt. I mean, if we borrowed this from financial institutions, I mean, number one, we probably wouldn't have the option on the table even available to us to try to make the bank's workers repay the debt we borrowed from the bank. That'd be an interesting thing to try to negotiate. But number two, no bank, no financial institution in the country would agree to a repayment structure that jumped in significant leaps and bounds from year to year at a level it knew we didn't have the money to afford.
Well, two questions come to mind. Well, one, so I said if you could tell us in 30 seconds, and I know you said it's hard to do, but I'm still not sure. Can you articulate, other than the ramp, other than you were advocating a program, it sounds to me, and I think it would sound to the viewers, that would suggest we can't, it's not sustainable to pay $4 to $5 billion a year under our current regime.
It's not just $4 to $5 billion a year. Okay. That misses the point. Okay. It's the ever increasing repayments every year. Okay. In out years, it's $16 billion.
So you're saying if it were just $4 to $5 billion a year,
we could probably swallow it.
Because Bill Brady sat where you're sitting, and he said over the next 30 years we're going to have to pay about $200 billion. And I said, Bill, that's $6 billion a year. You think we can do it? He said, we're going to have to. So he's a guy who ran for governor. I don't know whether that means anything. You can even be governor. With all due respect to both Bill Brady and Pat Quinn, doesn't mean you folks know what's going on, doesn't think that you have a plan. So you can be that and be right, or you can be that and be wrong. But he at least suggested something like $6 billion a year, and that's something he thought we could do. And he didn't say to me, Jeff, you got it wrong. You're going to have to pay $16 billion some years. So are you saying Bill Brady got that wrong?
Yes, he did. Okay. I mean, so in fact, it's going to escalate up to north of $7 or $8 billion in just about 3 or 4 years. And so that's really what's created the fiscal strain. You might be a pretty smart guy when it comes to looking at tax and economic policy. I might feel like I'm pretty good at designing tax fiscal policy. I can't design a tax system that jumps billions every year over and above the rate of inflation. The best you can do is create a tax system that grows with a modern economy with inflation and population.
So as you know, back in the spring or so, Governor Pat Quinn articulated his plan. He'd not in the form of legislation, but I think he said enough to know, for most of us who followed this, we kind of knew what he was talking about and what legislation would have to do. He didn't write it for us, but he basically said there are 3 things that have to be done. You have to increase the retirement age for state employees. You have to, they're retiring too early. Some would say it depends on the area of their work and so forth, tends to be in the 55, 62 range. I think he says in most cases has to go closer to 67. So that's 1. 2, the employee contribution for pensions has to go up, tends to be 8%, should be closer to 11, 12%. 3, the COLA has to be reduced significantly, cost of living adjustment. And as you know, it's kind of a misnomer because the COLA has been something that's just an automatic 3% a year. So
compounded, by the way.
Compounded. So the cost of living could be going up 1.5%, it's going to be 3%. Cost of living could be going up 5%, it's 3%. Yeah. It's unrelated, but that's, you know, people like, see, they like Coke. I don't know if we can do this. We're not advertising for Coke, but the phrase COLA, you see, Coca-Cola. I mean, here's Coke, but Coca-Cola. This is not advertisement, folks, but just making a point here, you know, demonstrative aid, as we used to say in the law. Cola stuck. People thought, oh, it's just a cola, that's fine. Everybody likes cola. Even I like Coke and cola, but that's another matter. Okay, so colas have to be modified down, and that's what the proposed, most of the proposed legislation would say something like half of the CPI or 1.5%, whichever is less. So lately that would mean instead of a 3% increase, a 1.5% increase. Still going up, but by lower rate, and as Ralph points out, not compounded, simple increases. Okay, so Quinn says if you do those 3 things, and you do them roughly as I said, you'll deal with, over the next 20 or 30 years, you'll deal with the unfunded debt. You'll make up about 70, right now he says it's 83 billion unfunded, you'd make up most of that. Was Pat Quinn wrong on that? Or is it just that, was it, let me say,
I
let
think
me finish the question.
he's giving you apples and oranges.
Okay.
You may be able to cut $70 billion off the payment stream, but the payment stream goes out until 2045. So $83 billion is the current unfunded liability. It's not what the total repayment has to be to the system to make up for that $83 billion
Brady's
over
saying
time.
it has to be $200 billion. Brady's
Right.
closer to the
Brady's
accurate
closer to
number.
accurate there. So that's sort of an apples and oranges comparison the governor gave you. And even if you gain it, so there are issues with the governor's approach, and some may say that a portion of what he's asking for may not be constitutional in Illinois. We're taking no position on that. It may or may not be.
That's another, that's a
It's a whole
big issue that's
out there. Whether or not they actually did an actuarial study to look at their numbers, or whether they did some
you don't know, and I don't know.
We don't know, and they haven't. Okay, right. So let's just assume the whole thing that they want to do is constitutional. The whole thing they want to do is the right approach, and I have some questions about that anyway, even though pension benefits did not create this unfunded liability. Like I say, nothing inherent in the system's created this problem. It's purely an issue of the state not making its employer contribution from 40 years and diverting that revenue to fund current services, borrowing against the pensions.
Let me just point out that there are people who differ with you on that without taking the whole show on that.
I don't know who those people are.
John Tillman.
Okay, well, John's just simply, can I just say he's just simply wrong on that?
Well, you can say that, but you could say you were wrong, and that wouldn't solve anything.
I'll give data. So the Commission on Government Forecasting and Analysis, which is a nonpartisan, it's consistent, equal members, Democrats and Republicans, they say that. The pension they say that the pension unfunded liability was caused by underfunding for decades, not by anything inherent in the system. And in fact, they have data and graphs that prove it. All 5 of the pension systems and their actuaries and their fiduciary boards say it. So John could take any position he wants. It's contrary to data, but the data are the data.
John points to data. Just let me say, John points to data, and others would point to data that say that state salaries here have been above the competitive market benchmark, both in terms of cash salaries and in terms of pensions, and when you add the two together, they're above their private sector counterparts.
Okay, so let me just give you
some point to studies to support that. You may then get to, are those studies good or bad?
Oh no,
we could spend the whole show on that.
Let me just get to that because it's a real simple thing.
Okay.
So the employer normal cost, the normal cost for these systems, paying for the benefits, all 5 systems on a weighted average basis, is about 9.3% of payroll if in fact you put the money in. The cost of Social Security in the private sector is 6.2% of payroll. The cost of a 401k plan is 3% of payroll. Sure. In other words, 9.2% of payroll. No, Jeff.
No, but you're only saying, you're referring to the employee costs when you said that, because you said 6.2 for Social Security.
No,
everybody knows the employer is 6.2, the employee is 6.2.
What I'm saying,
so
no, I'm splitting it out by employer and employee.
Okay, so you're saying the employee cost is 6.2?
Yeah,
because I didn't hear the word.
And the employer cost is also 6.2. I'm looking just at the employer.
Okay,
so the total employer cost is 9.2 in the private sector for Social Security and a 401k plan. The total employer cost for these systems is 9.3%. It's virtually identical. These are not high-cost systems. This is just not accurate. You just look at the reports by the fiduciaries.
There's also the question of whether the salaries. There's also the question of whether the salaries are
we'll get to the salaries. We'll get to the salaries in a second.
Okay.
But the weighted average benefit paid under these 5 systems, I mean, there's abuses, and some of those abuses have been reined in. But those abuses have been immaterial from a fiscal standpoint. And in fact, the weighted average benefit across all 5 systems, about $32,000 a year. And 78% of those workers don't get Social Security, so that's the entire benefit. So on the benefit side, it's a relatively modest benefit system, and it's a low cost.
Can I just ask you, do you know what the average retirement payout is for people on Social Security? The median. Do you know what it is? Well, do you know what it is?
Social Security isn't a benefit
system. No, but let me just ask you.
Social Security, Jeff, Social Security is meant to keep people out of poverty. That's all that it is. It's not a pension system.
No, but the point is,
this is
all many people have. My point to you was, sometimes people come on this show, some of the folks who are unions or union types or union supporters, and they say, you know, these folks, this is all they have, this government pension. They don't get Social Security. And their government pension may be $40,000 in many cases. I think the teachers' pensions, are median, of $40,000, perhaps higher.
About 41.
Okay.
Actually,
Many,
so you're under by
I don't know. I
1,000.
don't know what the median is for Social Security, but many people in this country only have one pension. It's Social Security, and it's often about 20,000. It's half.
Okay.
So what people are who are watching this show, Ralph, they're looking at it and say that it's one of those people who worked, put in money into Social Security. They're living on 20,000, and they're wondering why. If you're going to suggest, or somebody else is going to suggest, raising their taxes to pay for a pension that's twice what they get. That's what they're wondering.
Okay,
Address that, if you will.
Well, sure, because that's a totally rhetorical way to put it, and it's actually not at all accurate.
They're wondering that.
So we're going to go.
I'm not wondering.
We wouldn't have had to raise their taxes now to pay for any debt that the state owes if, in fact, we'd taxed appropriately for the last 40 years. So answer number one.
But we haven't. I mean, that's the point.
Jeff, let me answer the question. Let me answer the question.
Okay.
For the last 40 years, our tax revenue didn't support the level of services we provided. We spent more than we took in for 40 years. The way we got around that in Springfield was to borrow against the employer contribution to the pension system to subsidize the delivery of current services. So for 40 years, taxpayers didn't pay for the services they consumed. The pension system paid for a significant portion of it. Now, the debt that we borrowed from the pension system is due, and it's due according to a repayment and amortization schedule that's unattainable and unaffordable. So net, 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 we do need to adjust tax policy in this state if we want to continue consuming public services at this current level, because our tax system doesn't support it and hasn't supported it for 40 years. And it's not a pension issue. It's a very simple, the state has services at this level, but unfortunately its revenues support them at that level. So that's number one. Number two, you're comparing apples and oranges. So the workforce at the public sector, for the most part, is much higher educated and credentialed than the private sector at large. Most public sector jobs require at least a bachelor's degree, if not a higher degree. And so all the studies that have compared on a meta-analysis basis, private sector to public sector workers, only those that adjust for the payments made in the private sector from a salary and other compensation schedule for equal levels of degree are legitimate or educational attainment, and those studies all show the private sector still pays more. So once again, if in fact you just want to make the case public sector workers are paid more than their private sector counterparts, you can do that as long as you ignore educational attainment. Unfortunately, educational attainment is directly tied to wage in the modern economy, and that's ignoring way too much.
That's the problem. See, number one, I don't want to go back and forth, and I want to make sure you have enough time to get your full answer. I only don't want to go back and forth too much, so I want to get to the end of at least the pension discussion. I was hoping to get to some other issues, and I'm looking and I guess we've got about maybe 12 minutes left. Chester's going to tell me by holding up a number. How many minutes do we have left, Chester? Chester's thinking. Anyway, so roughly 12 minutes. And I want to get to the end of the pension thing, where we are now and what we would do. So I'm happy to do this some back and forth, and I'm only trying to keep it short, not to cut you off, just because I want to get to the end, unless you want to come back next week and finish the show. And I know it's hard to get you out here even for one. I know, you're a busy guy, and we appreciate you coming here. But I'll say just briefly on that, there are people who've studied this. They are smart people. They are economists, just like people who've studied and support the view you're taking are smart people and they're economists. I'm not saying there are any stupid people here, but smart, intelligent, reasonable people can reasonably disagree on this. And so there are people who say, even controlling for education, even controlling for that, you're finding that private counterparts are paid less than their federal counterparts, partly because there may be an overweight on degrees. For instance, in education, as you know, public school education, we often pay people more whether they have a master's degree or a PhD. There may be little relationship in terms of their ability to teach, having the degree. There may be other federal and state sector jobs who do the same thing. I know that, and I think you might know that too. If you have a master's degree in economics, you'll be paid more. May not be related to the quality of your performance and what you're doing in that job. So there perhaps is too much weight, and then when you look at this and people study this and say, oh, federal employees have more education than their private sector counterparts. That may be true. I don't know, but it could be true. But it also may be true that the private market doesn't reward that because it doesn't think
No,
those.
I-
It
no,
does,
no, I think there's
can I finish my
there's a
sentence?
difference
No, but let me finish
that
mine.
you
I
need
let
to
you
look at.
finish. I won't go on. It doesn't reward that because the private market doesn't think those are marketable skills. It doesn't think demand and supply. It doesn't think demand and supply warrant a higher
Can I just counter
salary.
that point with data?
You can, but I'm saying...
Because, so from 1980 to 2007, not including the Great Recession, U.S. Census data show that the only cohort of workers in the private sector, excluding government workers, that saw a real increase in their wage had a college degree or higher. So the private sector absolutely values a degree and education.
It depends what the degree is in, Ralph, whether it's in engineering or whether it's in sociology. You're aggregating so much. You're missing what I'm pointing is making.
I'm saying that the private sector, in fact, and the data show, it pays a premium to those who have higher level of education and attainment.
On average, stick in that word on average. On average.
And in fact, most job creation in the private sector, especially in Illinois, has been in the low-paying, low to no benefit, and no need for academic or educational attainment service sector. So if in fact most growth is in retail sales and hospitality and health services, but not the high-end health services, the low-end, the orderlies, those kinds of things, and that's where most job growth has been in Illinois and in the nation for the last 20 years. Those jobs are lower paying and lower to no benefit than any jobs in the private sector or frankly the public sector that require degrees.
Okay, we'll get to that. But
So,
I want to get to back to
the data really don't support the argument that the public sector.
You can take the view that your data is perfectly clear.
It's not my data. This is census data.
No, but I'm saying the data that you point to are perfectly clear, and they support your position, and your opponents, ideological opponents, public policy opponents, don't have good data. You can take that position. My position is that the data are more mixed in this. I may think that the data going against your point of view is clear, but I would concede it's gray. This stuff is not, I mean, I've been doing this show now for 15 years, and I entered more partisan than I am now. You may doubt that, but I did. And my view after 15 years of doing this, the tough questions are less clear, conservative or liberal. They're somewhere in between. And conservatives don't like it when I say that, and maybe liberals don't like it when I say that, but that's the one thing I've learned from this show. The tough questions, like should we go into Iraq, or should we not? Or was it right to go into Iraq, or was it not? Or did the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 actually grow the economy or not? As we said at the University of Chicago, all questions, all interesting questions, I think Milton Friedman said this, are empirical questions. And if that's true, it's not the theory, it's the empirical, and you're a big person on that, okay? You want to get data. Then it's the nitty-gritty, the dirty stuff of looking at the data, sorting it out, and saying what's good and what's bad. And at the end of the day, Ralph, I'm saying people are intelligent on both sides.
They do, but one difference.
Nothing is just clear.
I'll put something on the table that sort of differentiates our approach to work than the Illinois Policy Institute. We send out all our work for independent peer review by academics who range across the spectrum from their ideological viewpoints, everything we do. So when we put out a report, it has been vetted by folks that are somewhat left-leaning to folks that are somewhat right-leaning in the academic community, and they've all signed off and said the methodology is accurate, the data is accurate, everything is accurate. No other organization does that. And the reason we do that is I have a unique charge. My board of directors is not nonpartisan. They are bipartisan. This means they literally dislike and mistrust each other. So our work has to all be evidence and data-based and completely supported by a peer review process. And most organizations, whether they be, and I'll agree with you on this, whether they be called liberal or left or right or conservative, and I hate those kind of labels because I don't think that they're helpful to the discussion at all. You either have a good policy initiative that comports with the data or you don't. But the bottom line is, whether they're left-leaning or right-leaning, wherever they are, they don't send their stuff out to peer review because they've got an argument to make that has to correspond with their ideological view of the world. We don't do that.
We only have about 3.5 minutes left, so I want to take a half a minute to respond and then see if we can wrap up on the pension side. in a half a minute, I did look at your studies when you talk about unemployment and you say minimum wages don't increase unemployment. And I actually looked at the footnotes and I looked at the sites. They weren't to the Journal of Political Economy, they weren't to the American Economic Review, they weren't to the Review of Economics and Statistics. Those are scholarly journals. They were to organizations that I saw, research organizations that have liberal bent. So I would respectfully disagree that everything that you have is peer-reviewed.
Did you look at the front of the report and who the peer reviewers are?
The sites for the specific sites.
So you were able to cherry. So Jeff, you were able to cherry pick out a few sites you didn't like.
No, it's an important site.
I don't find that either compelling nor necessarily convincing in any way.
And I don't want to go
back
back
I'm
and
sure
forth.
I could go through something that your guys have done and find innumerable sites that I think are objectionable.
Exactly.
But what's different
and they're not my guys.
Our full
I don't
report.
have guys.
But Jeff,
I don't have guys. You have guys.
Jeff,
I don't have guys.
Our full
my
report.
Guys are Chester out here who's telling me I've got 2 minutes left.
Our full report goes out to people like David Merriman at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, Fred Gertz at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, PhD economists who would not put their name on a report if anything from a methodological standpoint or data analysis standpoint was askew or unbalanced.
Ralph, in 2 minutes.
Sorry, that's different.
Okay, but in 2 minutes, what are we going to do now? For whatever reason, we have, some would say 83 billion underfunded, some would say we have 200 billion underfunded.
The cost of repaying the 83 billion will be 200 billion over time.
Now, some would say at least take a crack at it, at least increase the employee contribution, at least raise the retirement age, at least reduce the COLA. It may not, for the reasons you've said, solve the problem, maybe not even close to completely, but it moves you some of the way there.
About 26%.
And people would differ on that. Some would say more, some would. Would you say those three things should or shouldn't be done? Raise the retirement age, reduce the COLA, and increase the employee contribution?
Our position is pretty clear on that.
Okay.
We think that the political system is going to focus on the benefit side because it's good politics. So whatever they're going to do on that, whether it's the Democrats by themselves or the Democrats with the Republicans or the Democrats and Republicans in cahoots with the unions, they're going to do. And it's going to reduce a portion of the unfunded liability.
Does that mean you would do those?
But it's not going to
as a policy organization?
As a policy organization, we would focus on the actual problem, which is the ramping up. And that, unfortunately, is not on the table. And so here's what concerns me about this political approach.
I only got a minute left. Can I ask you one more question?
No. They're going to do this political thing. They're not going to solve the problem, but they're going to sell it to voters and taxpayers as if they had. And then next year, we're all going to be upset that the system, which told us it solved the problem again, didn't.
And now you know one thing that's hanging them up politically is the difference between Democrats and Republicans on the so-called cost shift. Put the school boards, school districts that are making decisions that affect pensions, make them pay more, if not all of these pensions. Should there be a cost shift or should there not? Yes or no? Can you give me a yes or no and then explain it? Because we'll run out of time.
In Illinois, no. If we were starting from scratch, yes. If we were designing a new
system, not you're saying no cost shift now.
No shift now, because in fact Illinois ranks 50th out of the 50 states in the portion of education funding covered by state resources.
Take 10 seconds just to interrupt.
And putting additional burden on local districts makes no sense in that context.
Sorry to interrupt, Ralph. I just want to thank you so much for coming out here. Ralph's a very busy guy. I know it's Sunday, it's tough, and so we're going to continue to speak as the grads roll. But thanks so much, and we hope you'll come back. Obviously, we didn't finish, okay? But you did get a chance to give your say, I think.
Yes, I did.
All right, so you'll come back and we can finish this discussion.